Hello everyone, welcome to another Fire Carrier Guide video. Today we're going to talk about Tier 6 aircraft carriers and the upcoming ranked battles in Season 7. So with that said, let's go straight into our game and have a look at the two aircraft carriers that we have to choose from. Now, this video is primarily focusing on aircraft carriers because that's my main forte and what I do, but we will touch ever so slightly on what we can come across against other ships to expect in the Tier 6 bracket. So, we have the Ryujo and we have the Independence. These are our two carriers, Japanese and American, that we can pick from. Now, most people will argue that the Ryujo is the stronger carrier, and I would be one of those for this ranked season in competitive style gameplay. However, we are going to look at both ships, and we're going to have a look at the two main setups that one could use with these ships, and how they kind of interact with each other in a sort of rock, paper, scissors kind of format. We'll also kind of very briefly touch upon the differences between the Tier 6 bracket and the Tier 7 and 8s, and what I expect the what they expect the battle meta to be like, at least on the very highest kind of levels of gameplay, and we'll also talk about the current captain setups I've got for these ships. So let's go straight into it. The differences between the Tier 7 and the Tier 8s. All right. So if I go into the tech tree, there's quite a big difference between the 6s and the 7s and the 8s. Tech tree to load up. The Tier 7 and Tier 8 brackets have a lot more ships that are capable of anti-air. The Atlanta, the Flint, the Pensacola, they're all theoretically defensive fire ships. The New Orleans, they have good AA. The Alabamas and the New North Carolinas, they have good AA, good range, that type of thing. From the Japanese point of view, once you're into the Tier 8 kind of side, not the best, but you can expect there are lots of cruisers that have good defensive fire, and they can mess up your day, especially in the Tier 7 bracket because the Japanese were using Tier 6 torpedo bombers, and the Russians had the Kutuzovs in the Tier 8 bracket. That was an annoying ship because it had really good strong AA and smoke bubbles and that type of stuff. The Chapayev also has very good anti-air, not to be kind of knocked out there. So there were a lot of the reasons why the Tier 7 and 8 tiers were hostile to carriers in the ability to attack. Now, that's not to say you can't attack what you want, it's just saying that it's changed from 7 and 8 because in the Tier 6 setup, if we go back to there, realistically, the only strong AA ship that comes to mind to me, the one that can actively kill all your planes and not annoy you, is the Cleveland. But it still exists, so unless if one team has a Cleveland and another team doesn't have a Cleveland, it's a strong advantage to the team that has it, obviously because of the AA bubble, and when we're going to talk about the plane setups and the fighter setups and reasons why. In the Tier 6 bracket, we don't really care too much about the battleships there. Yes, some battleships might have strong anti-air, between the New Mexico or... Well, not even that, because all we care about is the defensive fire. All we care is about what could mess up our attack. However, let's go into the setups for the two carriers. The Ryujo, the two setups are a sort of attacking strike setup, which is 1-2-2, one fighter, two torpedo bombers, two dive bombers, standard Japanese drop patterns. And then we have 3-1-1, three fighters, one torpedo bomber, one dive bomber. For the Independence, we're kind of strained here. There only really is one good setup for the Independence, which is 1-1-1. One fighter, one torpedo bomber, one dive bomber. You could hypothetically use two fighters and one dive bomber, but then you have absolutely no offensive capability, and your fighters aren't really that great, and we'll come back to that. And going strike in the Independence is like, why are you even in ranked? There's the door, get out. So, what are the benefits? There's basically three, maybe-ish, 4 ways to play the ships. But all of them have a plus and minus advantage here because there is no one build that is really good for everything else. Like if you went back to the Tier 7 or the Tier 8 game setup, the American carriers were always outclassed by the Japanese ones because the carriers from the Japanese could go 222 strike, and their 2 fighters could deal with the fighter setup of the tier 7 and 8s that had 3 fighters, so 3-1-2. So the 222 was still viable because the 2 fighters, if microed well, could at least hold off, or sometimes even compete with the strafe mechanics of the 3 fighters of the enemy carrier. With the Saipan in the tier 7 bracket, yes, you had players who played 3 fighters, but if you played 3-1-2 Hiryu, you could fight them with dogfighting, and then it all came down to strafing and exit strafing in the micro. However, if you played 2-2-2 against 3-0-1 of the Saipan, then it was your 2 fighters versus his 3 fighters, but you could still have the capability to bomb with 2 torpedo bombers, dive bombers, scout, because you can drop the payload and then you can scout with the tier 7 dive bombers and that type of thing. And you could provide vision, or you could do hits, so it was still viable. The difference in the tier 6 bracket now for the Ryujo is that it's 1-2-2, so it's just 1 fighter plane. That is also kind of awkward because the number of planes you have in the carrier itself is also heavily reduced. You're down to 48 planes compared to the 72 on the Hiryu and the Shikaku. This means that you cannot be as wasteful on the fighters as before. You have to be very careful. In the 1-2-2 Ryujo, you're very limited to the number of fight waves you have. Plus, because you only have 1 fighter wave, 1 fighter cannot fight against 3. So when you have a 3-1-1 Ryujo, yes, you cannot cross drop, and yes, your dive bomber, you can't scout as much and can't do as much damage, but you can rely on a fire and a flooding kind of dot mechanic working with your team. Your influence on the game is greatly reduced, but you have good sky control, and you can even scout with your fighters. As the 1 fighter on the Ryujo, it's very difficult, almost impossible, to fight against the 3 fighters of the enemy carrier. And this also applies to the Independence. You would never use 201 on the Independence, 1 dive bomber, 2 fighters, because the 2 fighters on the Independence still get outclassed by the 3 fighters of the Ryujo, because more fighters is more scouting potential, and you can choose when you want to engage with the planes. Alternatively, it also means that when your 2 fighters engage, he has this 3rd wave that is just loitering ready to strafe. He can strafe, exit strafe, so there's just more control on the 3-1-1 Ryujo. So you wouldn't want to use 2 fighters on the Independence because the perceived benefit of getting air control with the 2 fighters isn't going to happen between 2 highly skilled players. So that then brings the Independence back to the 1-1-1, which means it's only got 1 fighter. So in terms of setup, a 1-1-1 Independence, believe it or not, is actually theoretically viable in a good player's hands against a 1-2-2 Ryujo. Now, we're not talking random play here, we're talking semi-competitive or semi-skilled players. That is because the Ryujo has 1 fighter plane. The Independence has 1 fighter plane. Now, while the tier 7 and the 8 and even the 9 setups for the American carriers keep that 1 fighter plane, and it's not till the midway you get the 2nd wave, the Japanese get extra waves at the 7 and 8, and that makes it very difficult because it's 2 versus 1. But when it's 1 versus 1, that is when the Independence shines, and that 1 fighter from the Independence can actually outmuscle the Ryujo's fighter plane. And if the Ryujo player's not careful, he can't play that particular game mode in the sort of air control mode or going for sky control. It has to be in a scouting or bomber protective role to try and outbomb the Independence. Now, of course, the Ryujo is a better bomber with the ability to cross drop and having 2 dive bombers and the ability to do dots and fires and floodings and all that type of sense. However, the Independence is totally capable of sniping the Ryujo if he wants to with his torpedo bombers and the dive bombers. They are powerful torpedo bombers with that 1 wave, and the Ryujo doesn't have the greatest health pool at only 39,600, so about 5,000-6,000 below the Hiryu's, but critically, it does not have any bulge protection. So the Ryujo has no bulge protection, and if we go check the Independence has like 7%, so it's negligible. But the Hiryu, as you jump up, that has... Actually, you know what? I think I've forgotten. I think it's in the 21% range for the Hiryu bulge protection. So the point I'm trying to make here is that the Ryujo, although it has close to the same health pool as the Hiryu, it has totally not the same bulge protection, which makes it vulnerable to carrier snipes. And this then leads on to the AA setup of these 2 ships, but we'll come back to that in a moment. Now, in terms of who fights what, a 1-2-2 versus a 1-1-1 Independence game is you'd favor the Ryujo in the ability that he could scout more, he can go after the enemy destroyers, he can do kind of more work, but the Independence can muscle him out with the fighter, can get air control, and can snipe the Ryujo just as easily, theoretically, as the Ryujo can snipe the Independence, although I would figure the Independence has probably slightly stronger AA self-defense. If you go with a 3-1-1 Ryujo, then that locks out everybody. The 3-1-1 Ryujo is the dominant fighter that no one else can beat. Not the fighter Independence. The only way to fight a Ryujo 3-1-1 is with another 3-1-1. Now the problem there is that you are dropping the cross-drop capability of the torpedo bombers. You're dropping the scouting capability of the second dive bomber. You are more reliant on your team to make the kills or do the damage, and in terms of getting to ranked 1 with maximum win rate, I don't particularly like going 3-1-1 with Ryujo. Yes, it's powerful, and I prefer to go 1-2-2, but something tells me in the various highest echelons, a lot of players are going to play Ryujo 3-1-1 simply because it gives them such kind of sky control, similar to how Saipans last season were playing 3-0-1. It's because it gives them really strong air control. They can deny sight, they can give sight, and they can do a limited amount of bombing. So I expect the meta to see a lot of 3-1-1 Ryujos. I'd like to be proven wrong. I'd like to see a lot of 1-2-2s. I would much preferably play 1-2-2 Ryujo, because if I only have to deal with 1-1-1 Independences or 1-2-2 Ryujos, that's great. It's fine, because I can outbomb the enemy and I can outplay them and outmicro them. But if you have to play 3-1-1 Ryujo, you cannot compete against a 3-1-1 Ryujo with just one fighter plane on the 1-2-2. If you had 2-2-2, 2 fighters versus 3, that's doable, especially with the 2 dive bombers that can scout and kind of stretch the planes out. But if it's 1 versus 3, that totally can't work, because he can keep one fighter to lock your one fighter, and his 2 other fighters can go bomber intercept. As opposed to when it's 3 versus 2, where if you're not very careful, your 2 could lock into his 2, and the third wave that he's trying to go for your bombers, if you outplay him, it's just the margins of error are too close. But 3 versus 1, it's really powerful on the Ryujo's side. In terms of the ship setup, there's not much different from random. You go with the premium, the damage control party 2 on both ships. On upgrades, it's the exact same setup. We're going with fighter strength to boost up the strength of our fighters. Even with the 1-2-2 Ryujo, you basically want to get that fighter as powerful as it can be. And then we take the damage control system mod 1 and 2 to reduce the chance of having fires and flooding, and then to reduce the time that you are on fire and flooding for said carrier. In terms of captain setup, well, first things first, we'll go into exterior. Basic camouflage. If you want something else, that's great. Combat signals for me are the flooding chance, the AA signal, and the speed. You could drop the speed and you could take an additional fire chance within your X-ray. That's kind of personal preference. I personally like the speed so I can move around the map if I need to, if it's a particularly close game or if I'm being hunted. In terms of the self-defense of AA, neither ship has a defensive fire, regardless of what setup you're going. Now, the 3-1-1 Ryujo is going to be fairly safe from sniping attempts, unless he's on some sort of low ammunition with the planes and he's caught off guard. But with the 3 fires you'd expect, you don't need to rely on your AA. But if you're going 1-2-2, or even 3-1-1 to an extent, the captain setup, the AA guns on the Ryujo favor the manual fire AA control. So if we go into the captain here, show the kind of the ship setup. Oh, this is how I'm going to play it. You know, your mileage may vary. Come on, ship parameters. Any day now, UI. So here we go. The 80 guns, we do get some reasonable 80 damage. This is with basic fire training and the signal at 5 kilometers. Now the captain is only 15 points. If this captain was a 19-point captain, I would probably take advanced fire training. If I was going 3-1-1. If I was primarily playing 3-1-1, I would probably take advanced fire training. If I was going 1-2-2, I might not take advanced fire training, and I might go with the torpedo armor and expertise and priority target, as I do with my higher tier 9-10. Depends how quickly I want to turn the torpedo bombers, but ultimately, depending on the number of AA ships and how the meta plays out, it could be the fact that you're not racing to take the torpedo bombers off and do as much damage as quickly as you possibly can. You are taking them off and you're waiting for a target of opportunity, because in 7 versus 7 games, you're basically waiting for someone to isolate himself and then attack him. That's not necessarily going to happen right at the beginning unless you take off immediately and you try and go for a destroyer snipe. So in that respect, I wouldn't take Torpedo Armor and Expertise. I would take Basic Fire Training as a 3-pointer skill, and then it's the same as my Tier 7, Tier 8 captains. You're using the core AA, boosting the amount of damage you do, boosting the range, and then boosting the damage of the long-range AA guns, along with Air Supremacy. Now, the detection is quite good on the Ryujo in terms of how not detectable you are. 9.6 at sea is about as low as I'd ever want it to be, mainly because any lower than that and you get spotted by a destroyer, ship detected, you don't have a lot of time then to react to... Okay. You want to shut up? Well, anyway, you don't get a lot of time to react and turn your ship around, run away, that type of thing. So there's kind of like a balance. You want the detection to be high enough so that if your ship detected, you can make appropriate actions, spot it with your planes, ask for assistance, or bomb it. But at the same time, any less than that, you know, you're not going to have enough time to react. It does offer you the ability to get close to the enemy. The 7.9 detectable air is also very, very good. It's so the Ryujo detection-wise is a good ship. The Independence, have a quick peek over here, is also reasonable. 10 kilometers is not bad for ship detection by sea, and 11.5 is a little high for the air, and it does mean you can't get as close or try and hide behind islands or whatnot, but that's fine, because usually you're going to be in a 7 versus 7 game. There aren't going to be many ships that are going to be flanking you. You can stay somewhat further back or slightly out of view, and it's not a big deal. But at 11.5, you just need to be slightly careful, because if I was playing a Ryujo playing 3-1-1, I might use that one dive bomber to scout your ship out of a range of around 11 kilometers, and your AA can't help. Now, with regards to an Independence captain setup, this again is another 15-point captain. However, we'll talk about where the extra points would go. Aircraft Servicing Expert is kind of a no-brainer. Torpedo Acceleration. If you're playing 1-1-1 Independence, then obviously you would take this. If you're going 2-0-1, which I don't know why you would ever want to do that, you wouldn't need Torpedo Acceleration, so maybe you would go with Expert Rear Gunner to give the extra dive bomber some tankiness or something. I don't know. You know what? Let's just pretend you're not using dive bombers. You're not using 2-0-1 on the Independence. Now, when it gets to the third skill point, it's debatable, because the torpedo bombers take quite a long time to load on the Independence, but at the same time, targets of opportunity are not necessarily going to be forthcoming right at the beginning. You might not necessarily want to snipe at the very beginning. You might want to load the fighters first to kind of deny sight at the beginning. So I'm thinking more along the lines that in the tier 6 meta, carrier sniping is probably going to be a big thing, and you don't want any of your team staying behind to defend you, because that means they're not the front line, so you need to be self-sufficient, so we take AA. Now, the problem with Independence is it doesn't have any high-caliber AA guns over 85mm. It only has 40mm and 20mm guns. However, they are quite strong. They do have good AA values when you take basic fire training. So rather than taking manual fire control for AA armament, I've taken advanced fire training first as the 4-point skill, so that I can boost the limited range of these American AA guns out to 4.2 kilometers and basically do as much damage as possible. Because you need to be reliant, if you play 1-1 and the enemy carrier is going to come in to snipe you, you need to be able to focus as torpedo bombers, run away at maximum speed, keep your tail on the torpedo bombers, and hope that your AA can do as much damage that your fighter then can come and assist and help you. And you need to be able to survive at least one bombing wave without your fighter. That's the key there. And a 1-2-2 Ryujo he's going to have a hard time alpha striking you, because he's not going to get all the torps to connect, and he's not going to get all the dive bombers, but what he could be doing is basically baiting your damage control party, then following up with a flooding and a fire. And in that instance, you really need your AA to do as much damage as possible to his torpedo bombers to reduce the chance of torpedoes hitting you, and then also reducing the chance of the fire flooding taking effect. And then the last point would be air supremacy. You take that first as the first 4-pointer, but it goes without saying. Now that's a 14-point. The extra skill points, I probably wouldn't take Concealment Expert, because that reduces the concealment perhaps a little bit too much, so you can't react. I would probably take Torpedo Armament Expertise, and then probably Priority Target, because that would then take you up to 19 points. Just to know, it's not enough to know when you're spotted, it's not so nice to know when you're actually physically targeted. And then dogfighting would also come into play as well. In fact, I might even spend 1 point on dogfighting, because although the tiers at tier 6 are all tier 6 planes and no one gets a benefit from dogfighting, the extra ammunition does go a long way for the strafing and the exit strafing and the ability to escape. my expectations of this meta is probably that 3-1-1 Ryujo is going to be dominant. I feel that the 3-1-1 Ryujo, begrudgingly, is very powerful. It gives you excellent sky control. That's not just means you can scout the enemy. It means that you can deny sight by the enemy team coming onto you. You can spot destroyers with your one dive bomber, and the one torpedo needs to be used smartly, but you basically go for anything that's wounded or anything that's pushing too much. However, the one torpedo on the Independence and the Ryujo is going to make it very difficult to cross-drop destroyers. This is where the 1-2-2 comes into play. If the enemy team plays poorly or the enemy carrier is poor, you can swap between the two setups. If you find that the enemy carriers you're playing against are bad, then 1-2-2 is definitely the best hard carrying setup on the Ryujo. However, if you don't have a Japanese ship and you've got an Independence, I would play 1-1-1, and it's still totally viable. But if you're playing against very competent players that are playing 3-1-1, you gotta swap to 3-1-1 on your own Ryujo. There's just no other option because it completely locks out the game, and it's not fun for anyone. In terms of ships to be aware of and to be alert about, I'm fairly certain, although I'm not a destroyer player, that the Farragut can play with a defensive fire, but the number of games that people see carriers up until the previous seasons has been limited. So normally you would find ships running hydro, acoustic search, for detection of torps and ships and smoke, rather than playing defensive fire, because the number of carrier games they come across is somewhat reduced. So it's unlikely to come across a Farragut defensive fire. Cleveland's, they're always going to have a defensive fire, I feel. They might run IFHE on their main guns. They might not be AA spec, but they're always dangerous, so you have to be careful. And that's probably the only real one at the tier 6 bracket. Not too concerned about the Arizona, not too concerned about the New Mexico. It's tier 6 bombers on tier 6 ships. There are no tier 7s. So if you've played the Hiryu with tier 6 torpedo bombers and you've used them against Bismarcks and some tier 9s, in the tier 6 bracket, this is actually really good. Your bombers are actually pretty damn powerful in their own tier. Against Japanese ships, the Nagato can have good AA. Oh, not Nagato, sorry, that's tier 7. What am I talking about? The Fuso, that's a joke. He's long, he's easily hit, that's a good target. The Oba could theoretically have a defensive fire. I find it dubious he'd probably go with Hydro. The Fubiki, the Hatsu, they definitely don't have defensive fires. The Mutsu is, again, a nice long ship, not the greatest AA. You can totally strike these as targets. There's nothing really to be too concerned about. And for the Soviets, well, the Bodoni can have a defensive fire and it can be annoying. I don't know about the Marakov and the Molotov too much. The Navy definitely doesn't have a defensive fire. But the thing is, the tier 6 cruisers, you just need to be alert. Do they have a defensive fire? Can you bait it? And only the Cleveland realistically has the strongest AA in this tier. The other ones are sort of you need to anticipate the fact that they do have a defensive fire and play around it, or try and find out if they do have it by using dive bombers, perhaps, unless it's like a desperate element of the game and then you have to attack. But for the most part, again, only the Cleveland's real threat at the moment at tier 6. For the Germans, we do have the Bayern. Bayern can have reasonably good AA, but again, the Gneisenau and the Bismarck have much better AA than the Bayern, and tier 6 torpedo bombers, when used right with the right approach, with the Hiryu for example, you can still damage the Gneisenau fairly well with a 2 torpedo bomber attack, and the Bismarck, again, you can still attack it and get a fairly good number of hits in with a Hiryu. So if you use a tier 6 bracket with the Independence or the Ryujo, even with 1 torpedo bomber playing against the Bayern, you can guarantee to get at least 2 torpedo hits, and if you get a flooding in there, that's quite powerful with the 3-1-1 setup. The Nuremberg could have a defensive fire, but because it's a German ship and the German advantage of Hydro, I'd expect you to find Nurembergs having Hydro, and that makes them actually juicy targets as a 1-2-2 Ryujo. But at the same time, you might get caught out, so you use your dive bombers first to see if he doesn't want to trigger or be baited. The Graf Spee is a fun. I enjoy playing that ship. It's kind of a love-hate relationship. It can have a defensive fire as well. Some players may choose to play it with Hydro if there's not a lot of carriers in the meta. I would always play the Graf Spee with defensive fire, and it's annoying that the defensive fire isn't there to kill planes, it's there to mess up your drop, kill a couple of planes, and that's what bugs me. Only the Cleveland would kill all your planes. So it's something to be aware of and to watch for. But again, tier 6 planes in the tier 6 only bracket, it's quite powerful. For the British, we are aware that there may be British battleships coming around. The British battleships may be released during the season, and if that's the case, then you can look to see a Queen Elizabeth tying up with the Warspite. The AA of the Warspite and the Queen Elizabeth, it could be long range if they're going secondary spec. We don't know the final specs for the Queen Elizabeth at the moment, but again, it's tier 6 planes against tier 6 battleships, provided you approach them and don't fall them from behind, or don't, you know, spend too long inside the AA bubble chasing the ship. As long as you come at a right angle and stay inside the AA bubble as short as possible, the British battleships are not going to be an issue. The Leander, it doesn't have a defensive fire. You could actually go ahead and attack it. The only thing to be aware of the Leander is that it does have good maneuverability. So you'd need to be a 1-2-2 Ryujo to realistically hit it effectively. With just one torpedo bomber, it kind of acts like a destroyer. So the Independence and the Ryujo would have a hard time striking it. If the player's paying attention, either turning into or turning away, or just kind of making sure that your bombers stay inside his AA envelope for as long as possible. It can be annoying. However, because there's no defensive fire, you don't have to worry about the Leander providing support to a battleship and that type of respect. So your damage mitigation is not going to happen from the panic effect on yours. Nothing on the Bliska, Pan-Asia, Anshan, we don't really care about him too much. The French, the Dunkirk has laughable anti-air. The De Grasse, I don't actually know about the De Grasse because I don't have it, and it's a relatively new release from my point of view. The La Glacionier could also have a defensive fire. Again, it all comes down to the I mean, it's meh. Actually, it's quite poor. It's only got, unless he takes, it's only 5 kilometer range, and it's only 20 and 25. It's not that strong, the De Grasse. And I imagine we check out the actual mainline ship. No, that's even worse. Look at that. Above the 85mm guns are quite poor. Yes, the mid-range are reasonable, but only defensive fire is realistically going to be a nuisance in that particular element. So that's a brief overview of the tech ships. If you go 1-2-2 Ryujo, there's nothing you can't realistically damage. Only the Clevelands are a threat, and even the tier 6 Clevelands, they are not a threat once you've baited the defensive fire. If you can bait the defensive fire with dive bombers or a dive bomber, or you can bait it with your torpedo bombers and only lose 1 or 2, or like just 1, once the defensive fire is down, he is actually quite vulnerable, unless he's like totally AA spec'd his captain with like manual fire AA control and basic fire training and the signal flags and all that type of stuff. Even then, you can go back in and you will probably get a number of hits. If you approach at the right angle and coming from the right plane, you will get a number of connections, and you can wound him or you can kill him. It really depends on the player skill. You're probably looking more to wound or finish off if he is already wounded. But it always comes down to, did you get caught up by his defensive fire? Did he kind of pick you off? Every other ship, though, is totally plausible. All the battleships in the tier 6 bracket, with the right approach, are totally vulnerable to a 1-2-2 Ryujo, which is why I want to play a 1-2-2 Ryujo. However, it's one of those things where I don't think I'm going to get the opportunity. I think because of the enemy carriers playing 3-1-1, in the early brackets you might get away with 1-2-2, but in the later brackets, from the rank 10s and lower, there may be a prevalence of 3-1-1 Ryujos just going for air control. And then you're just going to have to play around it, because there is no one setup that beats everything. You can't have everything. You can't have strike capability and air control like the 2-2-2 setups do in the tier 7 and 8 bracket. Anyway, that is it for a tier 6 overview for the Ryujo and the Independence. If you have any questions or you want to know a little bit more, then by all means, please do mention in the comments. I will probably stream my games in the tier 6 ranked, as I have done in previous seasons. So we'll see how we get on. Anyway, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Goodbye, guys.